Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is John Fleiter, and I serve on the Lou Douglas Lecture Series Committee. On behalf of the committee, I would like to welcome you to the third Lou Douglas Lecture of the fall 2001 semester. The Lou Douglas Lecture Series on Public Issues is sponsored by the UFM Community Learning Center. Founded to honor the memory of political science professor Lou Douglas, the series deals with topics pertaining to human rights, social justice, world peace, and international development. The fall 2001 series is dedicated to Mary Douglas, widow of Professor Douglas. Mrs. Douglas was a teacher, a community activist, and a patron of this series for many years. She passed away earlier this year. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Olga Davis, Assistant Professor of Performance Studies and Women's Studies in the Hugh Downs School of Human Communication at Arizona State University. She will be introduced by Phil Anderson, who teaches speech at KSU and is a member of the Lou Douglas Lecture Series Committee. Our thanks go out to President Weefald, Provost Kaufman, various university colleges and departments, the Student Government Association, faculty members, and many local citizens whose contributions help support this series. After the lecture, there will be a brief question and answer period. We encourage you to stay and participate for that session. Dr. Davis will also be signing her new book, Centering Ourselves, African American Feminist and Womanist Studies of Discourse, co-authored with Marcia Houston, tomorrow from 11 to 12 noon at the K-State Student Union bookstore. I noticed there were a few copies out in there in the hallway. If you'd like, you can purchase those tonight and get an autographed copy tomorrow. Okay. Thank you for coming.
I met Olga Davis in 1994. She was a recent Ph.D. graduate from the University of Nebraska in the area of rhetoric. And I really enjoyed meeting her. She was a lot of fun, and we kind of hit it off as colleagues. And we began kind of stopping in at each other's offices to chat, to share ideas. And the first time I stopped in her office, I noticed a picture on the wall. And I recognized it as being from a Greek play, and the person that appeared to be in the lead, the female lead, bore a striking resemblance to Olga Davis. And I commented on it. I said, "Olga, who is that?" And she said, kind of shyly, "That's me." I said, "Olga, were you a theater major?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, this woman continues to surprise me. I said, "Where?" Because I was a theater major at St. Cloud State, so I knew a little bit about theater. She said, "Juilliard." I said, "The Juilliard School? You were a major in the Juilliard School?" I said, "How did that happen?" I didn't mean it to sound like that, but how did that happen? She said, well, I was one of 600 invited to audition for the Juilliard School, and John Hausman auditioned us. 25 of us made it, and I happened to be one. So I went to Juilliard and was trained as a classical actor. I said, "Well, did you play any other roles?" And she said, "Yes. Lady Macbeth, Queen Margaret, Iphigenia, Hecuba." Wow. I mean, I was bowled over. And then I asked the obvious question. Well, I said, if you're a classically trained actor, why are you teaching rhetoric at Kansas State University? And just then, the John Lennon line kind of slipped into my mind. The John Lennon line is, "Life is what happens when you're making other plans." She said, "Well, I met a man named Freeman Davis, and he was a singer in Juilliard, training for opera, and we fell in love and got married, and after Juilliard, we moved back to Los Angeles and began having a family. Freeman, however, as singers needed to have a voice coach. And the voice coach for him, the best one that he could find in the country for him, was at the University of Nebraska, which is where they went. And Olga thought, well, as long as I'm here, I'll just pick up a Ph.D. in rhetoric. Of course, it wasn't quite that simple, but it did lead to her to be able to study something that she was personally interested in and culturally interested in, and that was slave narratives, which are the narratives of pre-Emancipation Proclamation slaves, principally female slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation, as you know, freed the slaves during the Civil War around 1863. So that's what she studied. When she came to Kansas State, then she actually taught a course in slave narratives, and I was privileged enough to see those performances that they did at the end of the semester and how thrilling they were and how important they were to our department and how much those students learned from that as she was able to combine her classical training in theater with rhetoric. One of my visits to her office resulted in her telling me a story that was quite troubling. And it's a story we'll hear about tonight. It's a story that needs to be told, is being told, and I think we as a nation need to hear it and need to learn from it and need to grow from it. So please help me welcome Olga Idriss Davis.
Good evening. I am so very honored to be here tonight with you. I feel like this is a homecoming. I've been in this space, this building, many times before, and I'm seeing old familiar faces and young familiar faces that are just a joy to my soul to be here, to see them. And I see new faces, young faces, faces of you who, many of whom were not here when I was a professor here at Kansas State University. So it's wonderful to see you all out, and thank you very much for coming to my lecture this evening. I would first of all like to thank the individuals who have helped to support this moment that I'm here. My research is an ongoing moment in time. This particular moment is just a snapshot of the work that I have been doing and the work that will continue, I hope, to be done with the assistance of grants and fellowships and all those sorts of things that professors do to try and maintain their research. But I'd like to especially thank Kansas State University, and particularly the Big 12 Faculty Fellowship Committee. Back in, I think it was 97 or 98, that I was given a Big 12 faculty fellowship that allowed me to begin the research of going to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and finding survivors, those individuals who were a part of the Tulsa race riot, but they were survivors of that race riot. I was able to interview several of them. Since then, I was able to get funding from my university, my current institution, Arizona State University, in the College of Public Programs, Dean Schneider, and also my own department, the Hugh School of Human Communication. And so I thank, first of all, my first family here at Kansas State University, who saw the efficacy of my work and saw that there was a need to at least help begin the process of trying to chronicle narratives, trying to put a sense of meaning on those stories that you'll be hearing about in the next time that we have together, and to find out how people performed survival. So again, thank you to those individuals. And also I'm going to make a little plug here for a gentleman who doesn't know I'm going to say his name, and in fact his wife as well. Professors Barry and Aruna Michi. They are very special people as well because because of Professor Mitchie, I was able to acquire several tapes that I am still in the process of attempting to have transcribed from a friend of his who worked for the British Broadcasting System back in the 80s, I believe it was. She and her husband traveled from London, and she happened to be a journalist. She documented some interviews of people who were in Tulsa, who were Tulsans, and who had either lived through the race riot or they knew something about the race riot. Professor Mitchie said, as he heard that my research was on Tulsa, he said, well, you know, I believe that a friend of ours did some documentation on this, and, you know, we still have her tapes in the attic, in our attic. And I went, whoa, what did you say? And he said, yeah, they're up there, and, you know, it's a kind of old dusty box, and, you know, certainly I can't just give them to you, but I can give you her phone number and her email address, and should you wish to contact her, you can possibly see if she would let you borrow them or look them over. And I said, thank you, yes. I did call Ms. Lippman and then ended up emailing her. She lives in South Africa. And she heard of my work. She said, Olga, I really have no use for them. And if you can use them, if they're still workable and they're not too old, I would be happy if you found value in them. And so I would like to thank the Mitchies for being so very nice and kind and telling me about that and giving me, again, a wealth of research that still has yet to be developed because I still have to transcribe, and that's an enormous amount of time. But it is also part of this ongoing research, and I thank them as well. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile, with torn and bleeding hearts we smile and mouth with myriad subtleties. Why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. Paul Laurence Dunbar. I became intrigued with the North Tulsa community and the Tulsa race riot of 1921 at a time in my life when I was searching for answers to my heritage, my family background, and my cultural history to pass on to my children. For years I had wondered what my paternal grandfather, a prominent physician, one of the first black physicians of Tulsa, Oklahoma, was like, who he was, and why family members and relatives eluded my questions about him. As a child growing up, I was told, don't ever ask your father about your grandfather. What's this? A hidden story, I said? Wonder why they tell me not to question. Well, being the precocious child that I was at age 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and on, that was the very question I wanted to ask, and I was determined to one day snoop, dig, and resurrect the stories surrounding his life. During the completion of my doctoral degree at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, I had to decide on a topic for my dissertation research. I pondered for a long time, then settled on the study of African American rhetoric and the role of narrative as an emancipatory and liberating form of resistance in black female slave narratives. However, during my indecision, I decided to mention my dilemma to my father. He said, well, why don't you write about Tulsa? There's a lot of history there and history about our family that you don't know about. I thought, Here's my opportunity to ask the unaskable, the unthinkable, the forbidden subject of my youth. I intrepidly began my query. Daddy, what was Grandfather Sneed like? He became silent, then responded, your father, your grandfather, was a fine man, a dapper, and one of the first black physicians in Tulsa, and a social activist. He spoke out against Jim Crow's segregation and organized people when he was supposed to be silent. He was taken away to prison, and we lost him to lynching. He then paused for what seemed to be to me like a lifetime, then said, you know, I'm 70 years old and I still miss my father. Somewhere between the pain of that statement and the unheard tears of my father as he quickly hung up the phone, only later to mask his pain under the guise of a bad phone connection, I knew I had to locate Tulsa within me. The search for identity is an ongoing search for myself within the shadows of the people who have struggled, resisted, and survived the racial, economic, and social intolerance of the United States of America and life in America for black people. My research has guided me, not as a canine sniffs out a bone, but as a motherless child searches for an unknown parent. An orphan gives up to adoption, searches relentlessly to discover what comprises her personality and health history. Or a veteran, returning from war and looking for that which will make him or her whole, the inclusivity of community. When the Tulsa race riot is mentioned now, it is spoken as something of the past. In the Tulsa World of February 2001, the Tulsa World being a newspaper, a Tulsan complained, well, you know, the Tulsa race riot is just history. You read about it, you learn from it, then you move on. But I ask you, is it as simple as that? What does it mean to move on? Does the past inform our present? How does the past decisions affect our present political situations? What of the stories of survivors, and how have they overcome the haunting memories of burning homes, bombed businesses, and charred corpses lying in the middle of the booming black business streets of Greenwood and Archer? The survivors of the race riot are not thought of one by one, but as a group, a sorrowful, pitiful group, dead, buried, and forgotten. Yet their stories, told by some who are still living, just about 127 at last count, are narrative discourses. They are stories that reveal lives of courage and love, struggle and resistance, pain and despair, and transcendence and hope for future generations of the Tulsa community. Mrs. Mabel Little, at the time that I interviewed her, was 101 years old, and she was a community member. She states, we have lost our memory as a people, so that we have no clear vision of our future. We have lost our sense of direction, if not our sense of purpose. We're going to have to return to the past to see where we have been so we can know where we are going. Not to get bogged down in the past, but to use the past as a springboard to a new and as yet unimagined future. We must take the best of the past and leave the rest alone. We must regain our memory as a people so that we will never again forget to make our future. We must turn to the future for wine and bread and bid the past adieu. But the past must live in our memories. I dedicate this presentation to Mrs. Mabel Little. She died January 13th of this year Ironically, it was the same day that I was in Arizona, in Tempe, at Arizona State University, giving another presentation on my research on the Tulsa race riot, and happened to share many of her comments to me with the audience, and not knowing that she was passing away at that very moment that I was speaking. Mrs. Little was 104 years old when she died, January 13th, 2001. But she had a vision, and that vision, along with many of the other individuals I'd like to share with you tonight, have said about Tulsa past and Tulsa present and beyond. Acknowledging Ms. Little's admonition, this paper examines the ways in which survival identity is a collective memory of struggle and resistance, and how survival is performed through narratives of the Tulsa race riot victims. This study examines personal narrative as the cultural, political, and ideological frameworks that form a society's definition of itself. In other words, I am interested as a communication scholar at looking at the ways in which we use language, particularly stories, and the way we tell stories to understand the past, the present, and the future. I also see that narrative is a way of helping people cope and to heal and to recover from atrocious experiences that they've undergone. And many of you who might be studying social work, family studies and human services, communication studies, a host of disciplines might see the importance and the significance and maybe even the contributions that narrative discourse and the study of stories, how it might embellish the kinds of work that you are doing and that you will be doing in the future. Recently, notions of survivorship and experience have inundated popular culture with the proliferation of television shows and web TV. When people hear about performing survival, many of them think, first of all, when they see my name, that I'm going to be performing. And I consider this a performance, but it's not a performance in a dramatic sense that you might have thought. And then, of course, when they see survival, they think of survival in terms of the television show. And that's kind of our most contemporary views of survival. However, scholarship on rhetoric and performance sheds light on survivors in a different context. A look at the stories of survivors of one of the most heinous riots in American history, the Tulsa race riot of 1921, illuminates the role of community as a performance of survival. Performance in this context means the ways in which we look at how people create a sense of self, a sense of community, a sense of resilience in being able to go on despite the vicissitudes of life that would, in any other situation, basically kill them, put them to death. Somehow they garner up whatever it is within. I tend to believe it's the human spirit that pulls together and says, you must go on. You mustn't be bitter. You mustn't hate. You must wake up every morning, put a smile on, and say good morning, and believe that this day will be a new day. And that's a resounding sort of theme that comes through a lot of survivors, including Holocaust survivors, Japanese American survivors of the internment camps, the Native American survivors of the boarding schools, and of course the Tulsa race riot survivors as well. You might notice that I use the term survivor as opposed to victim, because I do see that their glass is half full rather than half empty. And it's also the way that they define and name themselves. Listening to the ways in which people name themselves tells us a lot about how they see themselves and a lot about how they view their own identity as well as their collective identity. And so it's very interesting to see this notion of survivor as opposed to victimage. Centering narrative discourse of riot survivors and their families, this paper and this lecture explores the ways in which survivors communicate a lived experience of survival while negotiating cultural memory, community, power, and resistance. More importantly, African American survivor narratives craft a unique space for public discourse that informs how survival is a performance of struggle and serves as a means of maintaining identity. My visits to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and to this day there have been two trips to Tulsa, Oklahoma. Hopefully, if I receive an NEH grant that I've proposed, I intend to go a few more times and hopefully gather a few more interviews. But those visits have informed a historic, cultural, and scholarly need to obtain and record the narratives of these race riot survivors, while underscoring the significance of oral history in human communication research. This paper asks, how does a narrative of survival transform public discourse into a collective performance of struggle and resistance that provides a space to interrogate the intersecting meanings of race, nationality, and community? I'd like to share with you a PowerPoint presentation that, as I do this, I'm a professor, as you have heard, and so I'm going to be engaging you as I would if I were teaching a class. So I'll be going up and down, and I have a tape for you, and so I'll be integrating some of my presentation as well as sharing with you a little bit on PowerPoint and also on video. My video, I must mention, is an edited version, little snippets that I've edited from a larger body of work, which is a documentary that was done by PBS, Public Broadcasting Service, out of the American Experience several years ago, and it's called Going Back to T-Town. So I wanted to let you know, I don't want to take the credit for it, although I would kind of wish I could, a documentary from the American Experience. So forgive the little snippets that seem like they're, kind of short, but I'm doing that so that you can hear a few of the narratives and some of the individuals I interviewed as well that are on the documentary. First off, I would like to give you a little information here about the personal narrative. This is the kind of methodology and context, theoretical context that I'm using in my study. I look at personal narrative research, and personal narrative is a way of knowing carved out of experience. So some of you who might know the term epistemology, that term means it's a way of knowing, it's a way of understanding the world around us, and it is just a way of looking at what people say and how people use stories to create their world and to make meaning of their world. Personal narrative research is also a critical praxis. It's a practice. It's a way, it's a process of learning how people construct a theory about life. So theories of the flesh, meaning it's not a textbook theory. People have lived what they believe. People have lived what they know. People have lived their lived experience. And so their theories are theories of the flesh. They can talk what they're saying. They can know what they know because they have lived that knowing. They have lived that meaning. And specialized knowledge, that just means that they know that knowledge because they have lived it. They have lived in the skin of that knowledge. And finally, the teller's experience illuminated as an advocacy discourse for social change and affirmation, meaning that stories are discourses. They are bodies of knowledge that provide us ways to create advocacy, social advocacy, and we can make changes by listening to other people's stories. Case in point, the stories of several of the individuals that I interviewed have been stories that have been documented by the Oklahoma Historical Society to be used in the Tulsa Race Riot Commission's report on the reasons why reparations should be given to race riot victims. So those stories, again, were evidence trying to persuade the governor and the state legislature that individuals who are survivors need to have reparations. So that teller's experience is very important. and therefore personal narrative is something that is very rich and valuable. Personal narrative is cultural memory. When we talk about cultural memory, we're talking about how do a people, a body of a people, remember something that is a collective memory. Every single one of us who's in this room, I'm quite sure, even if you were out of the country, will remember forever. You know what I'm about to say? Yeah, you'll remember it. I'll remember it. We'll remember what we did, what we smelled in our homes, or maybe you were here on campus. I live in Arizona, so it was only 6:40 in the morning. I was getting my kids up and waking up the husband too. And we'll all remember that. There's a collective memory that we all have. And so when we talk about personal narrative, we're referring to how individuals talk about memory. How do they tell the stories of what they remember? And in those memories, what sorts of themes are weaved through that connect us, inextricably connect us as a culture? Narrative provides a context for remembering the creation of community. We remember how to build community. It helps us form community by talking it out, by catharsis, sharing it with someone else, weeping, and trying to somehow, as I told my students, get my head around what happened. Try and somehow process, as a dear friend of mine in family studies often says, trying to process this notion of what occurred. Narrative helps to articulate the meaning of what it means to be American, of citizen, of human, and re-articulates the ideological functions in a culture. What do we mean by being an American? More than any other time, I believe, in my lifetime, we have seen within the last month a resurgence of patriotism. And we are coming to grips with this, basically an ideology that maybe we haven't had to think about before this. Or we thought about it in terms of textbook knowledge. Suddenly we're living what it means to be American. Or we're not living what it means to be American. But we at least have to think about that consciously. And again, the narrative, being able to talk and hear stories of what we're going through and others, helps us create a sense of where we are to function and how we are to function in a culture. Narrative offers ways of understanding the dialectical tension among the personal and the political spheres of identity. That means dialectic. In our field, we talk about this tension. Oftentimes it's a tension between what is my identity personally and then what is my identity when I'm with a group. And so sometimes we have to try and negotiate that. We're standing here going, well, should I be who I am when I'm by myself, or should I be who I am when I'm with my friends, and now my parents are here, so I should be more like I am when I'm at home, and oh my goodness, you know, we're conflicted. Well, it's that dialectical tension that out of the narrative helps us work through those very interesting dimensions of the personal and the political sphere, who we are as community members and who we are in our personal identities. And personal narrative as dialogue refers to the space to interrogate the past and create a vision of the future. We're able to look back and get a sense of what that means, but we also are able to look forward and say, based on what has occurred and based on the stories that we've heard, we get a sense of where we need to go. It's what Mrs. Little said to me. We must move beyond the past, but we must never forget the memories that have been created because of the past. Personal narrative as dialogue offers groups ways to repair and redress differences. Reparations are basically how do we repair something that may have happened a long time ago, but it impacts today, and then what we need to do, you know, for that, and how do we somehow redress those differences? How do we repair? So with narrative and with stories and understanding the voices that oftentimes have been silenced, we can come to understand some sense of repairing and redress. A process of self-healing and recovery is also the way that personal narrative serves as dialogue. we can come to understand ourselves and to heal from very difficult times by that idea of self-healing and recovery. The group of themes that emerged out of my research are the following. In my interviews, as well as the research that I've done beyond just the narratives, I saw that there were several themes, and I've only used 4 for tonight, but they are economic struggle, family and community coalition, never forget, and the post-tragedy redress. Greenwood at the turn of the century. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Tulsa was a burgeoning place of opportunity for black pioneers in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The post-Reconstruction period in America found black people grappling to make sense of life after emancipation and trying to craft an existence of freedom in the face of white Southern anger over the loss of Civil War. When federal troops pulled out of the South in 1877, Reconstruction officially ended. It was during this period that many black pioneers of Tulsa embarked on what was called the Promised Land. Indeed, Tulsa was a place of promise for black sojourners coming from the southern states such as Mississippi, Tennessee, Texas, and it was a place of new beginnings. The journey from the South was symbolic of African Americans asking with their lives and the lives of their families the question, what does it mean to be black and to have freedom in America? This was absolutely something totally new to them. Tulsa, they thought, would have the answers. It was the state that touted a grand reputation for oil production by the year of statehood in 1907. Oklahoma led the nation by producing 1/4 of all the oil produced in the nation. And by 1915, the state produced up to 300,000 barrels of oil per day. African Americans had found a place to flourish in communal, social, and cultural ways, and had found a site to resist the Jim Crow segregation by developing and maintaining the place they called Greenwood. What I'd like to show you now is a piece of what Greenwood may have looked like, and also what a few individuals said about the Tulsa and the Greenwood Business District. Greenwood was a business section of North Tulsa in Tulsa, Oklahoma. North Tulsa being the black side of town. In segregation times or Jim Crow, that was the legalized period of segregation in our society. On. Please hold. Oh, here we go. I think it's on now. William?
Just to get my women alive. Greenwood growing up was a very... The spirit was such that you, on one corner there was the Holy Ghost, the other was heroin. Not that that is a desired thing.
You'll see different scenes.
Over on the other side of town, in downtown Tulsa, and you did the wrong thing, a policeman would stop you and he would tell you in very nasty terms where you could eat and where you could drink and where you couldn't drink. And then they had signs up, you know, no colored could for drinking fountains and eating places. And we stood up. We couldn't even stand up and eat in Tulsa for a long time. It's a downtown area. But we didn't worry about that too much because in the Greenwood area we were quite complete. We were unique.
Bostic was from here. We had Clarence Love was from here. A lot of musicians that went all over the United States. Clarence Love had an all-girls band that traveled all across the country.
In 1907, when Oklahoma became a state, the all-white legislature moved quickly to make it a white man's country. They passed one law after another to keep blacks separate and in their place. Schools, hospitals, businesses, even telephone booths were to be segregated.
Basically in Oklahoma, right after statehood, you had racial bigotry that was out in the open. And I think that this had more to do with helping the development of black townships because blacks tended to congregate together for their own self-protection.
I started a beauty shop dressing hair in 1915 in the home. We had money, but we were not able to go and purchase things, so it helped us.
I'd like to just stop for a moment and let you know that this is Mrs. Mabel Little. At the time of this particular documentary, she was 92 years old. And as you can tell, she does not appear to be 92 years old. Let's continue.
Black people began to build.
A whole group of black entrepreneurs who came together and formed a kind of union to help develop black businesses.
The black business grew so in Tulsa until in 1936 it was announced that we had the largest black business in the whole United States.
But when we went on the white side of town now, you'd have white guys picking at you all the time and you might get involved in a fight. And the Ku Klux Klans were pretty rampant.
And part of it was because the Ku Klux Klan was located in an area just west of the black community itself on Main and Eastern. This was about 4 blocks west of where the primary black community was located. And we had to pass by this to go to places of employment and to go to and from school if we lived in service areas of the quarters. And it was just a hostile situation. There was always potential for violence there. Black people were not about to put up with the attitude that the white community was putting before us. The whites felt that they could instill fear in the black community, and
There was a merchandise store that had one of these old-fashioned elevators.
I'd like to stop it right there for just a moment. So what we've seen thus far have been a few people talking about what the community was like, and also what were some of the economic issues and some of the cultural issues and political issues surrounding Tulsa at that time. In the turn of the century, there was this burgeoning community of Greenwood, and yet in the dialectical opposition to that was, who are these new people who are coming into the community? Who is this new group that were previously slaves and now they are free, but what does that mean? And how are they going to somehow craft a sense of the world, a sense of life, a sense of identity? Several individuals have talked already about the Jim Crow era. But Greenwood was this site that tried to resist the Jim Crow segregation by developing and maintaining this place called Greenwood. Jim Crow was a way of life in America until as late as the 1950s. Laws were enacted in the United States at the turn of the century and codified into American law the notion of separate but equal. This notion of separate was indeed realized as blacks and whites lived separate lives in separate worlds, in separate communities, but those worlds and communities were anything but equal. Jim Crowism was the established order of the day in America, separate and unequal. A dialectical opposition to Jim Crow, I contend, is what led to the demise of the North Tulsa's Greenwood business district. One of my interviewees by the name of Mrs. Laverne Cooksey Davis recalls, "We left and moved to Oklahoma in 1916, settling in Pawnee. 3 years later, we moved to Tulsa. We left Texas because conditions were just terrible for black farmers like my dad. We heard that things were better in Oklahoma, especially in Tulsa, which was a booming oil town then. We heard there were many good jobs for black folks in Oklahoma, what with all those people coming in from the north and from the east. But I didn't find Tulsa to be much different from Texas. In Texas, my first job was washing dishes for a white lady in exchange for piano lessons. In Tulsa, the only job that I could find was being a maid for a white doctor in South Tulsa. After the Tulsa race riot of 1921, I left Tulsa. I just couldn't spend the prospects of spending my life being a maid." So this particular woman saw that there was really no hope for her in Tulsa under the Jim Crow segregation laws, and she felt she needed to leave because she refused to be simply and merely a maid. I'd like to now show you a little bit more of the piece in regards to this idea of economic struggle and what occurred to African Americans and within that community regarding economic struggle. The idea of economic struggle here has to do with Tulsa, which is called T-Town, as you saw. It was the Creek Nation territory prior to statehood in 1907. It was Indian territory. And as you know, during the early part of our 20th century and into the 18th and 19th century, we saw a proliferation of Indians being moved off of their territory, Indians having their land being taken by white settlers. So we saw that this was a nation territory that was theirs and was eventually taken and created. Tulsa was created into this town that later on became a state in 1907. Tulsa was the golden door of the black community during the early 1900s. Again, I hope you saw a little bit of that in the snippets of documentary, that they had this burgeoning community of theaters, of hospitals, of movies, of brothels. They did have brothels, of beauty parlors or beauty shops, as Mrs. Little was a beautician, and they had funeral homes. Gosh, just about everything you would think of they had, because they felt that if they had something of their own, they could find some way to develop an infrastructure that was economic to be able to go to be a part of the American dream, a part of the American system of economic success. Tulsa was also coined Little Africa because that was the side of town that was designated for blacks, and so of course it was related to Africa. It was also called the Negro Wall Street because it was very prosperous. Lots of money went on and was passed through the day and through the year in that community. One of the reasons why it was a very prosperous community was because the dollar went through that community. And I have a few points there in my next PowerPoint slide. 36 to 100 times that dollar circulated through the community within the year. As I said, it circulated, and it took about a year for currency to leave the community. So that tells you that they maintained the money within their community. And as we know, if we can maintain the money in the community and work with one another and keep that economic strength, you're a powerhouse as a community. If we also think about the historical context of that thinking, we also realize that this is within the Jim Crow era. This was during segregation. This is during this notion of blacks trying to find a sense of where we were to be in the entire context of the American family, politically, culturally, socially, economically. And it became quite a threat to the white community who felt, well, you know, what's going on here? You know, there's an organizing here that seems rather threatening. And out of that, various experiences occurred. Black Americans had a successful economic infrastructure on what was called Negro Wall Street. There were community members, including Ph.D.s, doctors of philosophies, attorneys. There were bankers, there were MDs, and there were educators. Some of you may wonder, well, now, where do they get those highfalutin kind of credentials? Where do they go to school? Shortly after slavery, during emancipation, many black universities and colleges, sometimes they were just little small schools, cropped up in the South because African Americans during the turn of the century and also before that, right after slavery, felt that knowledge was power and education was a way of getting the inroad into the American economic and social institution. And therefore they began voraciously learning. Many of them knew how to read during slavery, although that was something that was against the law, and if you were found out that you could read or write as slaves, you would be killed. If you weren't killed, your hands could be cut off, feet, or other very, very terrible things could occur to you because it was against the law for a slave to know how to read or write. So as you can see, this idea of education was very, very important. And as a result, many community members in the black community became PhDs and attorneys and MDs. My grandfather went to Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, and from there he went to Meharry Med School. Both of them are, at least at the time, were historically, what we call historically black colleges and universities. Fisk University is known for it being an all-black institution. And those institutions were not black just because they wanted to be separate from white students or white people, white community members, but it was the law to separate. Blacks or African Americans were not to mingle with whites and vice versa. And so because of that, blacks said we must transform that, we must rise above that, and we've got to find some way to teach our children, to help them have a better way of life than we do. The area of Greenwood Avenue and Archer Street maintained over 600 businesses and 36 square blocks. So as you can see, this community was a very, very prosperous community, 600 different types of businesses. The money that emerged from this group of businesses, some of them came from the South with money. Some of them were from old slave families who had saved and given their children money to go west, go into the Midwest, into Missouri, into some of the old black towns like Boley, Oklahoma, Langston, Oklahoma, a lot of black towns. In fact, Nicodemus, as you might know, right here in good old state of Kansas, was the black town here in Kansas. So a lot of these emancipated slaves moved north and west into the Midwest, trying to reach freedom and trying to find this story or narrative, if you will, of freedom. Greenwood business community had a population of 15,000 African Americans. It was just about 15,000 families, along, of course, with the businesses. The economic struggle in North Tulsa's Greenwood business district pointed to a larger story of racial violence and segregation legislation in Oklahoma. And again, Jim Crow refers, as we've talked about already, about the legalized segregation of African Americans in our country in the early 20th century, and even before then. You know, all of that time after emancipation, which is basically called Reconstruction period, almost into the 1950s. So we see that there was indeed a tension of trying to fit in and yet being stopped because it was being told, you might have freedom, but you don't fit here. And they kept saying, but we're going to try. We're going to try to overcome that. We'll try to find ways. We'll get around this way. We'll try to fit in. We'll try to go over that mountain. We'll try to find out economic ways. And they were oftentimes stopped at every turn. Reconstruction is a period that is important. Some of you historians probably know about this. But it's important to the theme of economic struggle in the Tulsa narratives because Reconstruction is that period of inclusion in the political, economic, and social realms of American life for blacks. That was a way, that was that time period, as I was mentioning, of trying to find ways to fit and to re-articulate ourselves as a black nation within the American system that had always defined us as slaves, always. From the time of traveling from Africa to here, African Americans were defined in this country as slaves, as chattel, not even as people, as property, as lower than animals. And so to try and come out of that image and redefine themselves was an absolute feat. Reconstruction celebrated the abolishment of U.S. slavery, which is the 13th Amendment, the establishment of citizenship and equal protection laws, the 14th Amendment, and it guaranteed political representation for all citizens, the 15th Amendment. Due to economic struggle, Reconstruction, and the search for this promised land of freedom, black settlers sought for a better land and a better way of life in Tulsa. So you see, I'm trying to show you that there was a struggle and also that resistance to them, but then they also resisted this sense of not being able to fit in by trying to overcome that and find new ways of being a part of the American dream. And the way they felt that they would be able to do that would be through the Greenwood Business District. Okay. I'm going to stop right here for a moment and turn back to what happened with the Tulsa race riot. In Tulsa, there was part of the Jim Crow era had to do with the separation of genders. That is to say that black men and white women were to be separate. And as we see that we kind of all look at one another and we might be attracted to one another simply because of our minds or maybe an attraction we don't think about necessarily anymore, or at least not in the same ways, that race is a major barrier. But at that time, race was indeed a major barrier. And so black men and white women were not to mingle at all, at all. Well, allegedly, what occurred was that there was a black man by the name of Dick Rowland, 19 years old, who was alleged to have assaulted a white female by the name of Sarah Page, who was 17 years old. She was an operator in a department store, an elevator operator. It is suggested that he walked into this elevator, Dick Rowland, and supposedly brushed up against her or fell into her. And supposedly she cried out, I don't know if it was rape or just screamed, and he got out of the elevator and fled, and immediately it was believed that he had assaulted her. A mob began basically saying, lynch the nigger tonight. And he ran to the Tulsa Greenwood community, the North Tulsa community, for refuge. Black men of that community said there will not be a lynching tonight or any other night, and went to the courthouse. The sheriff said, we will have to find out what has occurred, but we're going to have to put him behind bars. The white mob and community came and said, we need to take him out of here and do something to him. The black community said, no, it will not happen. And a black man happened to have had a gun. A white man said to him, what are you doing with that gun, nigger? And he said, I'll have to use it. If I need to use it, I will. Supposedly, an entanglement ensued, and from there, a shot rung out, and then apparently both groups, both races of men began fighting terribly, and then the race riot began. So they took it from the county courthouse fighting, and then a mob of whites decided to go into the black community, Greenwood particularly, and began looting, rioting, and pillaging the community, bombing, setting fire to houses, and just a major war zone it was. Let's hear a little bit about that from a few of the interviewees. You'll be hearing Mrs. Little's account of what occurred with Dick Rowland and Sarah Page.
And some white girl was the operator, and this young man got on the elevator.
When he went to get on it, he stumbled. And in the effort to keep from falling, he grabbed whatever he could, and of course the operator was in the way. And she assumed that he was trying to attack her, and she reported it, and he was arrested.
My husband asked to make a speech. He's the one that predicted that riot. Don't let nobody fool you. I don't know who else says they predicted it, but T.R. Davis, the father of my children, he stood up and told the people. He said, there's going to be a destruction in Tulsa.
And that afternoon, the Tribune came out and said what had happened, and that they had arrested Dick Rowland, and it looks like there's going to be a lynching tonight. And of course, when the Negroes in the community saw that, they said, oh no, we're not going to have that.
We went home from church here, come one by the house. Men, get your guns. Get your guns. Look like I can hear them lousy people, them loud-mouthed people right now.
There they were, hundreds of Negroes, standing around, talking, using profanity, and what have you, and shooting the gun every now and then. And then they felt, well, we better get on down to the courthouse. And they went down to the courthouse, and everybody was just standing around. Nobody said anything to one another. Finally, a little white man came up to Barry and said, nigga, what you doing with that pistol? He said, I'm going to use it if I need to. He said, oh, no, you give it to me. And he tried to take it. And that scuffling set the riot off. So the Negro decided they were going to make a stand at Cincinnati and Frisco Railroad tracks. But by being outnumbered, they had to leave. And of course, as they left, the white moved in. And as they moved in, they looted. And to hide their behavior pattern, they set fire to the building.
remember my mother putting us, my sisters and my brother, under the bed. I remember the people coming in, white people coming into our house with torches, setting the curtains on fire and setting our house on fire. And one stepped on my finger while I was under the bed. And my sister put her hand over my mouth to keep me from screaming.
They was burning and everything, set houses up there coming this way burning. It reminded me of Sodom and Gomorrah in the Bible. And we was going that way. He said, everybody get out in the opening where they'll see you and won't nobody get hurt. And he was right. He was right. Long as we was out where they could see us, they didn't bother. But they was shooting from airplanes and everywhere. It was a hot time.
We were afraid that they came to kill us, and they said, no, we came to help you. And they wanted to take the men and leave the women and children out there. I spoke up, I said, no, we want to go with our husband. If you're not going to kill them, kill us all together.
During the riot, black men had taken up arms to protect their families. Now they were charged with incitement, taken off to jail or the county fairgrounds, and tagged for identification.
I'll just stop it for just there a moment. You notice the individual who was tagged. I've been told by one of my aunts who's still living, who's 90, that my grandfather was tagged in that same way, so that he would be able to go out into the streets and identify the dead without being shot himself. And also, I suppose, to help those who were dying, either out of their misery or to take them to a hospital or give them some sort of medical attention. So that idea of tagging was, to me, very much a way of identifying, like we saw in the Jewish Holocaust, again, like the Japanese internment as well, that notion of tagging and of numbering. I'd like to now talk a little bit about the Family Community Coalition and share with you a little bit about what Mr. George Monroe, the individual who mentioned that his sister put her hand over his mouth because someone had stepped on his finger while they were torching his house. This other theme that emerged was the Family and the Community Coalition. There was a struggle for meaning and identity within the family, and Greenwood gave that sense of what family and what community meant. I'd like you to hear what Mr. Monroe said in one of his statements to me. According to Tulsa survivor Mr. George Monroe, we would remember Greenwood because it is and was the main thoroughfare through the black section of Tulsa. It was the nucleus of families that lived on either side of Greenwood. This was a street that ran straight through the northern part of the city, and you look at Greenwood, and Greenwood is an area in Greenwood, not on Greenwood. And he told me that that was very important because in Greenwood meant that Greenwood lived within you. It wasn't that you're just walking on Greenwood. When they divided this city, they looked at the railroad tracks and said, the black people are supposed to be living on the other side of the tracks. That's the way it is in most cities. You look at black people and you put that railroad between them that separates the whites from the blacks. They separated like that. But one thing they weren't thinking about, the location they were throwing at them. Right now, I can stand on top of my house and I can look downtown and see people building everything down there. All those tall, big buildings and everything else. They gave us the best place in Tulsa, Oklahoma to live. By mistake. By mistake. And we live over here. The land is flat. You go over to the other side, the south side of town, it's all you can do. Up the hill and down the hill, in the valley, all crazy like. You can't even go on the south side and drive. Tornadoes go over there, and all sorts of those things. As for damages over here, there haven't been no storms that did much damage over here, not on this side of town, not that I can remember. They gave us the wrong side of town, and we got it, and they want it back. So you see, Mr. Monroe's narrative is very insightful about that idea of family and that idea of community coalition and also that idea of the choicest part of town, of Tulsa, and of course its oil that was very much a part of under the black gold, as they call it, underneath the land. Not only does it underscore what he said, the issues of segregation, but it also pokes folly in the way in which the white community also suffered because of the Jim Crow laws. Moreover, the realization of better land and oil found on black owners' properties in the central location of the black community of North Tulsa caused even greater friction and crisis in this whole idea of trying to make a sense of meaning of their community. The other aspect of family coalition and community coalition that I found was the way in which people talked about the black family in relationship to the elderly. One of the individuals I spoke to by the name of Verna Cooksey Davis tried to remind us of the value of the elderly as wise griots, as the African culture mentions, that wise person that tells the stories, that is the keeper of culture, that is the keeper of the past memories. And she said, I've seen a lot of changes in my lifetime. One thing that I wish is that people would listen more to what elderly people tell them. These people have lived longer. They've seen so much, and they can give so much good advice if only people would listen to them. Many of them are good, wise, intelligent people who just may not have had the opportunity to get a formal education. We could learn a lot from them if only we would learn to listen. And they are often viewed as a burden in society. That not need be the case. I'd like to tell people, especially young people, to get back to being more loving, caring people. Families were more together then in 1921, and they reached out and helped others in the community. We cared about each other. We were raised to treat others as we would want others to treat us, barring none. We were taught to work for the betterment of all people. So this notion of the family, of community, and the wisdom of elderly indicates the significance of the Tulsa Greenwood's business section. The families comprised Greenwood. They were businesses, black-owned and operated, but this rich core of the community comprised the values of the family and a commitment to community. And Greenwood was designed as this infrastructure of the prototype of what black economic empowerment could be. The Greenwood residents created an image and identity through the symbolic representation of family, through coalition building efforts and the value of black notions of what the family meant and the strength of the family through the elderly all the way through to the youth. So when we talk about a way to teach the values and meanings of race and nationality and community, we saw that. We saw that embodied in the Tulsa community of Greenwood. And we also saw that it created bonds of community sufficiency without white intervention. They wanted to prove to themselves that they could have a thriving community without white intervention. In other words, segregation was to say, you aren't valued. They had to find a way to redefine who they were and say, we are valued. We value ourselves. We value our community. And we can work together without tearing each other apart, and we can work and take care of one another without being beholden to white intervention as they had experienced during slavery. Paul, did you please turn? Thank you. Oh, no, Paul, no, if you could just turn to the next PowerPoint, please. Thank you. Again, with the family coalition, they were formed between black families against the Ku Klux Klan. And as you saw earlier in a few of the snips, the excerpts that I had, the Ku Klux Klan was very, very involved in terrorizing black families and black businesses as a way, again, to threaten and to keep them from this development of the possibilities of being successful in America. You might say, well, why? What was the problem? I think what emanates out of hate is basically fear. I think that's the crux of hatred, is fear. Fear of just saying to someone, who are you? Maybe I should, just get to know you before I hate you. Maybe, to find out who you are, and maybe I'll find something out about myself and find out that maybe we don't have to hate one another. Maybe we can stop it. And so this idea of terrorizing them basically came out of that fear that maybe they would get ahead, and maybe they would get ahead, too far ahead from the white community. And there was some fear that could it ever occur that blacks would put whites into slavery? And my goodness, if that were the case, what would happen to us if they put us in slavery? So this whole idea of threat and of fear was the catalyst for a lot of the hatred that occurred during that time. The nucleus of the black community lived on either side of Greenwood, as I said, either side meaning that there were businesses, but there were also families on that street. And oil was also found in the black owners' land, and so they were very prosperous. So some people have asked me, well, where did the money come from for them to have this grand community? Much of it was that they had oil, that they began businesses, that they were able to support themselves, their businesses, and also help others to invest in businesses because they found oil, black gold, on their land. And as Mr. Monroe had mentioned to me, they were given or relegated or segregated to the best part of the city in North Tulsa. Now I'd like to talk to you, as I conclude, in the idea of never forgetting. And we hear that quite a bit when we think about the Jewish Holocaust and hearing Jews around the world say we mustn't allow the memory to be forgotten, the memory of the Holocaust, because once we forget, it will come again. In some other shape or form, it will come to destroy us again. And I found that in several of the narratives that I listened to, this notion that we mustn't forget. Dr. Charles James Bate, an African-American physician in Tulsa, pointed to the idea that to forget the history of black Tulsa destines the same type of genocide to occur again. Dr. Bates said that during the period of the race riot, there was a need to never forget what occurred, as well as to give back to the community as a form of coalition-building effort. So he saw that this notion of never forgetting is important for young people today, so that we don't forget the black history of that community, but also to be able to give back to the community now and build with coalitions. He states, we must never forget the past. We must especially tell the story of what black doctors went through in the past to pave the way for present generations of doctors and caregivers. Oh, we had some rough times then. Black people didn't have the opportunities they have now, and they didn't get the proper credit for their inventions and creativity. Why, they discovered things in the medical profession and in all other segments of society for which white people got the credit. I could write a book about it. In fact, I did write a book about the medical profession. Don't let people forget what we black Americans have been through. All Americans need to know this history, black, white, young, old, rich, poor, everybody. Young blacks today are ignorant of their rich cultural heritage, and white youth are arrogant because they don't know the heritage of black people. They think that everything was invented by white people. Yes, there is a great need for setting the record straight in the United States. Don't let people ever forget what we as black people went through. It was especially difficult in the medical profession, and we must never forget the rocky road that others went over in the past to make the path smoother for all of us today. So again, this notion of never forgetting is to memorialize the victims and survivors, to celebrate the elderly in the community, to recognize the efforts of white law-abiding citizens during the riot of 1921. I should also mention that Mrs. Davis, Cooksey Davis, mentioned that in their attempt to flee from being burned in their home, her family took them and ran, she and her siblings. And then toward the end of the day, they returned to the house being for sure that their house would be burned to the ground. And she said it was not burned. And they could not understand why the house was not burned, why it was still standing. She said that she found out later that it was because of benevolent, kind, poorer white people who were not a part of the white mob, who would see that the house was being attempted to, become burned and smoking, and they would go over with a pail of water and douse each fire, trying to put it out. Every time it would be set afire, they would go over and douse it with water. And these were poorer residents who lived down the road but saw what was happening in the black community. So I think it's important to remember that in the study of this, we're not saying that all whites were against the Tulsa community. But certainly there was a great deal of Tulsa that wanted to see the expungement or the expunging of black Tulsa. But yet there were still some whites who said this is atrocious and this is not something that we can allow to happen in our city. And because of that, many law-abiding citizens tried to do the right thing. Resistance and survival is an outgrowth of naming and speaking memory into existence. Because these individuals decided to speak out, Mr. Monroe, Mrs. Little, Mr. Fairchild that you saw in the documentary, and others, we have some sense of another view of the Tulsa race riot and of that period of history. We have heretofore had the master narrative, or the way in which history decided that history was going to be told. And these are counter-narratives that say, oh, excuse me, one more second, we have yet another story to tell about this context. And that countering of the master narrative oftentimes, again, causes threat, causes consternation between groups. And we are seeing that even in the more recent discourse and discussions on the Tulsa reparations. This leads me to my final discussion of the emerging themes that I was able to recognize in my research thus far, and that is the post-tragedy redress. As you know, redress means something has gone awry and we have got to try to fix it. We've got to do something to reconcile, to somehow bring about some sort of, again, community. When individuals and communities go awry, somehow, after it's all settled, the dust is settled, we've got to somehow try to come again, back together, and somehow make sense of our world. The post-tragedy redress began right after the Tulsa race riot. So the pillaging of that community, and for the sake of time, I won't show any more of the documentation there, the documentary. But the pieces that I had go on in showing how the individuals, the black families, were relegated to tents, basically to internment camps. The Red Cross came in and set up tents right there on the charred land of their businesses and their homes, just erected tents like you would go and camp out, camp out in, at any of the lakes around here. They set up tents, many, many tents, and they had to go into those tents and live. So there was no formal redressive action taken by the black community after the riot, and the reason why was because there was no court of law to whom they could plead their case. There was no redressive place or redressive state of law that was put into place for them to plead their cause. And they basically felt violated, but as oftentimes what happens in issues of rape, women feel, it happened and I have nowhere to go. I have no one to turn to. I will keep silent about it. And that's what many of the black community members did. They kept silent. Black families made homes out of tents to survive the burning of their houses and business property. Again, those homes and tents were makeshift, but they were these internment camps that were placed in that area. And there were a lot of deep, deep separations in relations to the black and white communities. Silence was among both black and white communities about the riot until as recent as 1982. There's a book that I encouraged the Lou Douglas Committee to have for all of you to at least peruse out in the lobby area, and that is called The Death in the Promised Land by Scott Ellsworth, a historian who I happened to have the opportunity of meeting in Tulsa, who wrote his dissertation on the Tulsa race riot. And in that time period, he was saying just about early 80s was when the silence was beginning to break. People were starting to talk about it, but still it was almost taboo, very much taboo, to talk about what occurred. It was a black mark, it was a smudge against the country, and particularly the state of Oklahoma, that something as atrocious as this could happen. And of course, as you heard in some of the interviews, it was alleged that bombs were dropped on the Greenwood business district of North Tulsa. It's been alleged, even from the 2001 Tulsa Race Riot Commission that was commissioned by President Clinton to find out about the Tulsa race riot. There still is allegations, but nothing confirmed that states that bombings and who may have bombed. And it's alleged that the American Air Force, it was our American government that bombed this particular part of our country, that bombed American citizens. And so as you can clearly surmise from that allegation, there could be, if that ever came out in terms of documentation, there could be real major serious concerns. What does that say, if that indeed is the case? It was suggested to me that while I was at the Oklahoma Historical Society to try and see or go into the National Guard archives, and an archivist at the Oklahoma Historical Society suggested that I do that, but he said, but be very careful even in asking about seeing anything that has to do with Tulsa. You might want to also be careful at your hotel, and this was at the time that I was living here. I rented a car and drove to Tulsa. He said, you might want to be careful when you go in and out of hotels, because people are watching you as you snoop and you dig and you resurrect a few things. And some people don't want you snooping around, even though that happened about 70 years ago. So be very careful. And of course, I told this to my husband, and he was quite concerned about my leaving Kansas and going there, even for a week, to do research. But again, the idea of being an outsider, going into a small town, people watch you, and people say, well, what's she digging up here? We don't want our history dug up, because there's a lot of, bad blood that's still there. So as a researcher, as an ethnographer, I'm also aware of the danger that can occur because of the research that I do, which is a little disconcerting at times. So they were told not to talk about it, both white and black communities. And the counter-narrative is that narrative that says we will emerge from this silence, and we will tell the story of survival and resistance and struggle, even though we have been told, and sometimes it's not been told in terms of discourse, in terms of speech, but it's almost an unwritten rule that they all knew. It's almost like I was always told as a child, don't ask your father about your grandfather. And I always said, what is that? And then I would listen to, the way people would begin to talk about him, and then suddenly it was like not too much that was said. And the reason why that happened was because my grandfather was lynched and castrated. And some of you who may know about lynching and castration, and it's awful to even talk about, and I won't go into the graphics of it. But my father still has not gotten over it, and most of his life was without his father. My grandmother remarried, but still, it wasn't his father. And when he learned what had occurred to him, he still has not processed that, I don't believe. But this whole idea of dealing with coming out of the closet, as we sometimes say, the closet of silence, that we mustn't talk about this, and yet others are saying, we've got to talk about it, we've got to tell it before we die. We've got to release ourselves, and we release ourselves through our narratives that we share with others. I wanted to tell you something else about my grandfather. Yes, but the idea of the lynching was very important, because if you spoke out, as he did, and he was a social activist, he was not killed during the riots, but afterwards was put in McAllister prison. And I have yet to either go there or go on the website and try and find different aspects of my grandfather's death and surrounding that. But I have been told that he was sent to the McAllister prison, and it was during that period of time that he was lynched. So there are deep connections here to my own life histories, and I'm finding my family in this research, but I'm also hoping to illuminate and to uncover for all of us so that we can recover our understanding of what it means to be Americans, and also how the past informs the present, as I said earlier. Many of you may know about the narrative of reparations, and I call it a narrative because the discourse that has emerged out of the talks regarding reparations for blacks with regard to slavery, reparations for blacks with regard to Tulsa race riot, all has to do, as I look at it, as a narrative. There's some sort of storyline here that is telling us something about who we are, what we think about, how we attempt or not attempt to repair some of the issues in our country, and also the issues that haunt us for years, and how we try to come to grips with those issues. Most recently, the governor of Oklahoma said that there will be no reparations for survivors, and that really was quite a blow to Mr. Monroe and to others who I interviewed, because they expected and they believed that their stories were sufficient enough to be able to prove things happened to us, and there should be some redressive action. However, at this point in time, as recently as 2 weeks ago, the Tulsa Race Riot Commission, in talking and speaking with the state legislature and the governor of Oklahoma, that there is some semblance of reparations, though monetary reparations has not been agreed upon. But there are scholarships to progeny of survivalists, those who survived their progeny or their grandchildren. There's a suggestion, a bill that is being presented that says scholarships may also be a part of that notion of reparations. There's also the idea to erect a monument for survivors, to be able to show that as a memorial, that this notion of erecting a monument gives a sense of recognizing that something atrocious occurred. However, the state of Oklahoma led by the governor, has not as yet said that the citizens, the black citizens of the community, that the state did everything that they could to protect them, so that the state is not the state has no reason to give them reparations because the state did all they could to protect their citizens, and that's what, of course, a government is supposed to do, to protect its citizens. The other narrative to that, or the counter to that, is that survivors are saying, no, the state did not do everything that they could to protect us and our families, because some of those men under the sheets were, in fact, the sheets of the Ku Klux Klan were, in fact, the same men who were our officials and our officials that were voted into office. So this idea of whose story is going to be the one that will define reparations or no reparations is still very much in contention in Oklahoma. And the narrative of reparations attempts to repair the breach to second and third generations of survivors. My father is the second generation of survivors. I would be the third, and on and so forth. But the point here is that though he, my father, and others of his age group were not the survivors, were not the ones that this riot was perpetrated on, but they felt the results of it by not having a parent, or by the psychological and emotional responses and behavior because of those riots. So there is at least something to be said about reparations in that regard as well. And the narrative of reconciliation means that community members are trying to find how to reconcile their differences through sacred and religious ceremony. When I was in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1998, the white and black communities, particularly the religious communities, attempted to come together as churches and hold hands and have a vigil, a candlelight vigil, saying that the white community of Christians said, we are sorry for what occurred, and black community members of Christian churches said, we forgive what has occurred. Let's unify as a Tulsa community, both black and white, and let's try to build from here. And so it was a beautiful ceremony. They've tried to continue it, although I'm not sure that it's gone each year since then. But that idea of reconciliation through ceremony is, again, part of this idea of narrative, of how do we talk about it and how do we get over or redress this horrible thing that is a part of our cultural and our collective memory. And finally, the narrative of community. The narrative of community redefines that collective memory of the Tulsa race riot in ways that somehow help us to heal and help us to affirm and unite both of those communities together. That's what many are trying to do in Tulsa now, to bring somehow some sense of closure to this, but also redressing it so that they can reconcile, build community, and go on from there. And again, discourse, the idea of communication, the idea of language, the idea of talking out ideas and trying to craft meaning between one another is what we call public discourse. And they try to do that as a way of creating public action, making a social difference, making a change in the public arena. Narrative of survival is that we are transforming oneself through new stories, these stories that have been silent and that are now emerging, and that humans are now finding in this Tulsa community a sense of freedom by being able to co-create meaning of self with these alternative stories, the stories that are different from the master narrative that said we will be silent. Those who are saying, well, let's have an alternative story now that says we will not be silent. Let's tell our stories. And so that those stories will hopefully help inform the next generations to come so that they hopefully will make a difference, that this sort of thing never happens again. If I might quote a very dear poet by the name of Maya Angelou in my concluding comments. She says, "You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise. Out of the huts of history's shame, I rise. Out of a past that's rooted in pain, I rise. I'm a black ocean, leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise into a daybreak that's wondrously clear. I rise, bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the dream and the hope of the slave. And they rise, and I rise, and we rise." Thank you.
Maybe a question or two. I'll give you a chance to leave, okay? Thank you all for coming very much. If some of you do have a question or two, we'll take maybe one or two after about a 30-second pause for those of you who need to leave, to go ahead and leave. If you do have a question, and we'll just take...
Good evening.
Good evening. How are you?
I'm good.
And what is your name?
My name is Lavelle Wilkerson. I'm a graduate teaching assistant in counseling and educational psychology right now.
Very good.
The question I had is in regards to reparations. Do you think the reason why maybe the governor declined reparations for the Tulsa, Oklahoma bombing victims is because maybe that possibly would have set some type of groundwork for reparations for slavery?
That's a good question. I think certainly that precedents could have been set had he agreed to it. Some of you may know that there is quite a bit of discussion regarding reparations for slavery, regarding African Americans, well, not just African Americans, but Africans, people of color around the world, the diaspora, the African diaspora. If you recall, prior to September 11th, there was a lot of discussion about the conference on racism that was in Durban, South Africa. Yes, Durban, South Africa. And part of that discussion, which quite a few of our leaders did not want to get into, was the issue of reparations for blacks based on slavery. So this is it's a highly contentious issue. And I also think that in giving reparations means that a government has to own up and say, we're giving this because we are in essence saying we apologize. We did something wrong. And that's very difficult for our government to say that it has been wrong in things that it has done to its people, and for that matter to other people, in the light of liberty and justice for all, or shall we say for some. So I think that he was very coy in that way. And again, as a politician, there were many of his constituents throughout the state of Oklahoma who absolutely refused.
Stage voice.
Reparations occur. And therefore, there certainly has been quite a bit of resistance to that happening. Very good question, yes. I think it certainly would set a precedent. Oh. Yes, please, baby, come on down.
Why did they call oil black gold?
Very
Very good question. And what is your name, young man?
Adam White.
Adam White. And how old are you, Adam?
10.
Oh, it's so nice that you came up to speak. Thank you very much. Very nice question. Why do they call it black gold? Well, first of all, it is because the color of oil, when it is coming out of the ground, is black. It's rich and dark and oozy. It's very black. And so that was one of the reasons why. And then, of course, the fact that it is gold means that it is, in fact, very rich. If one has oil, one indeed has gold. It makes one very prosperous because once one has oil, it's a major investment. In fact, even governments, Adam, fight over oil and deploy their troops into different places to protect those oil areas because oil means so very much. It means power if one has it and another country doesn't. If one person has it and another resident doesn't, it means you are more powerful. And unfortunately, oftentimes we as humans feel that we can become better than someone else if we have power. And then we try to step on another person instead of saying, let's share. You know, maybe I can share the wealth around. So they called it black gold because of its appearance, being black as it shot up from the ground, and then because it was a very rich commodity. It was gold. Thank you for your question. There's this one. Just this one. Can you do this? Sure. Gentlemen, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, my name is Jarrell Muhammad. I'm a graduate student in family studies.
And what is your name?
Jarrell Muhammad.
Hello, Jarrell.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Jarrell. How are you doing?
As of October 22nd of 2001, like today, are we not still asking ourselves what it means to be black and what it means to be an American? Dr. Geraldine Sue stated that 90% of the government is controlled by the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male. And I think that segregation has been recoded and is now called redlining. Jim Crow and black codes has reclassified itself to mean economic and educational inequality and the political disenfranchisement that we saw in Florida. I also think that, according to some of my research, that prison plantations still exist in the South. Reservations that the Indians now live on still exist throughout the land. Do you ever think with these problems, I know there's many more, do we ever all just get along?
Well, I certainly believe that I appreciate the comments that you made, and you are absolutely right. We here in America, we who are of the African diaspora, are still asking ourselves this notion of identity. I wrote a play, if you would like to call it that, a performance that might be presented here at K-State at some point in time. It's called Standing on the Hyphen, weaving threads of African American women's identity. And I bring up that fact. I bring up that issue of what does it mean to be African, what does it mean to be American, and then what does it mean to be a woman, an African American woman, and standing on that hyphen that we see between the two worlds, or between those two words. And yes, in fact, I believe that each of us tries to negotiate that. We try to find out, well, so what does that mean in terms of beauty? What does it mean in terms of education? What does it mean that you might have a Ph.D. and you might go to the Scottsdale Fashion Mall and be kind of watched when you go into stores, as though you might steal something? When in fact you're there and you probably have at least enough to buy something in the store. But the stereotype is that you are there to steal, and that there would be no reason to think that you were someone who would have any sort of credentials. So that idea of how do you negotiate that, and then how do you live through that and work it, get it all back together after being, upset about that, and then go on the next day and just say, well, it happened, let me shake it off, and let me go on. And our ancestors did that, daily. And so, yes, in fact, you're absolutely right. It has not changed. It's not gone away. Maybe some changes have occurred since civil rights, but we still have a long way to go. I don't think we can ever say, let's just get along. That's too easy. We can only get along if we, first of all, begin to talk to one another. And if we, secondly, begin to listen. We can talk at each other, but listening and being able to say, let me hear your story. Let me understand what it is like to live in your brown skin, or to live in your gender, or in your sexuality, or in your white skin. And oftentimes white people have never asked, what does it mean to be white in America? Because that's not a question you have to even ask. Because the normal standard is whiteness. And so to ask oneself that question means that one would have to interrogate, what are the privileges that are afforded me by the mere fact that I am white, or that I have had privileges given to me because of family opportunities that may have even come from oppressing someone else or another group, and I'm reaping the benefits of those in this day and age. So there are very conflicted and complicated issues to deal with, I think, when we talk about identity in any capacity. But unless we begin to start talking and listening to one another and listening to one another's stories, we're going to blow each other up. And with some of the recent events that are occurring, I think we're all thinking, where is our world going to? What's happening? And we haven't fixed, if one can use that word, we haven't fixed America. We haven't fixed the United States. We haven't fixed the United States all these years, centuries. And now we're dealing with another faction. It's some deep stuff. And I have children, so I too, and I teach, and I love my students, and I think, where are all these babies? Even though they're 20 and 22 and older, where are these babies going to be, and where will my babies be? So I'm trying to do what I can, in however long the good Lord gives me to live, to at least share some of this. And I see Professor Anderson behind me, so I'm going to say thank you so much for your time and listening tonight.
I want to invite them to come over.